Silence, please all rise.
Be seated, thank you.
The hearing resumes.
Dr. Diamond, when you're ready, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Chief Commissioner. Please, the Commission in Court session. I am presenting the Unions WA position on minimum and award wages. Unions WA relies on its initial submissions and submissions in reply to make its main points for our claim for an increase to award wages and the statutory minimum wage by 7%. This would constitute a increase of $57.39 per week at the C14 level of the Metal Trades Award. We would seek to make further points just to contend that the Commission should make what we consider a substantial real wage increase for award-reliant workers. Before I get too much further though, Unions WA wants to note that once again, neither the Minister nor the CCI have included a proposed amount in their initial submissions for this wage case. And while we acknowledge there is no specific obligation for any party to do so, Unions WA continues to be of the view that Section 50 parties have a responsibility to provide a figure as to do so is part of good practice. Statements around taking a cautious approach and vague statements around being responsible are not really good enough. The WA Industrial Relations Commission really is required by legislation to set an actual amount for an increase or otherwise to the minimum wage to apply to employers and employees covered by the WA state industrialisation system. And Section 50 parties have specific responsibilities within that system to do so. The Commission in court session may agree or disagree with any party's position, but in its ultimate decision, it ought to be expected that those parties should provide something. We acknowledge that in the practice of the federal government to not specify an amount in the national annual wage review, but to be frank, we don't agree with them doing that either. We think it would be a poor development for the state system if this becomes an accepted practice in WA. And insofar as both the Chamber or the Minister may submit specific claims in the future, we still think that this is unsatisfactory in that it doesn't really give much time for the Commission or other parties to consider them. That being said, we're pleased to hear from the government that it is saying that whatever increase should apply from the first pay period after the end of June. We think that is the correct way to approach the increase, whatever it is chosen to be. We also note with the importance that the Minister gives to maintaining and improving apprentice pay. And we also address this in our initial submission as well. We also want to make note that, cost of living measures, I should say, to address cost of living pressures, are not a substitute in any sense for an increase in wages. Our view is that the distinguishing feature of the tax transfer system in Australia is that it makes work pay for workers, not that it subsidises employers. And in that sense, we do not think it should be given a lot of weight by the Commission, particularly as government, as a rule, also provides substantial sort of assistance to businesses as well. So at the time of writing, only Unions WA and WACOS, as we said, have made a specific claim for an increase to minimum and award wages. We argue that an increase of 7% is a modest claim because it recognises, as we say in our initial submission, the reality that minimum and award wage increases have not been keeping up with Perth CPI inflation in recent times. Notwithstanding the welcome increase, which came in over 5% at the lower end, granted last year, I'd like to submit, if I may, Commissioners, a chart which basically illustrates the point we're trying to make.
Yes, certainly.
So basically the chart that we're showing you shows the percentage increase for WA award rates, and we're taking the lowest and the highest. So that's the C14, of course, and the C5. We conceivably could have put the C10 in there as well, of course, but I was trying to limit the number of bars. But basically to make the point that in 2021 and 2022, the sort of real, in that sense, the real increase in the minimum wage did go backwards, which is why we are maintaining a claim for a 7% increase to provide some redress for the fact that those workers, even on the highest award rate within the Metal Trades General Award, still did experience an event where their real wages did go backwards. Even our 7% would only mitigate this loss. That's why we say it's modest. But we argue that such an outcome would contribute to improving living standards of the low paid and fairness, of course, in the context of living standards generally. With that in mind, we do want to reiterate a point that I made when Mr. Christmas was appearing earlier today about household savings. Now, the household savings ratio, which is the figure that Unions WA uses in 3.6 of its initial submission, you'll see a chart there reproduced from the ABS. That's household savings divided by disposable income. We regard this as a more up-to-date figure than the figure that is being used by Treasury on page 14 of its submissions of the net household savings rate. Basically because, while their figure goes up to 21-22, the figures, albeit national figures, that the ABS hears goes to December, where they basically show that the household saving ratio declined from about 7.1% to 4.5%, which is the lowest level since September 2017. So while we have not embraced generally the proposition that savings should be seen as a substitute for wages when it comes to maintaining household consumption, insofar as that was ever the case, we simply don't believe, or there is certainly no evidence that it can continue to play that role. So that is the view that we are putting forward.
Just with the document handed up, it's not strictly evidence. So what we might do is just note that as an addition to your written submissions. That is the chart.
Thank you very
much.
Okay. With this in mind, the Unions WA claim to apply a 7% increase to rates above C14, the minimum wage rate, would improve fair wage standards in the context of living standards prevailing generally. This is because people on those higher rates are still facing the same inflationary environment and are also relatively more likely to be impacted by higher interest rates, and particularly the ending of people who are on fixed rates and the replacement by variable rates in their home loans, for example. Referring to paragraph 2.3 of our initial submission, you'll see that we reproduced some data there from the CommBank IQ Cost of Living's Insight report, which basically found that, of course, no surprise, cost of living pressure varies across age, life stage, affluence and home ownership. And while many groups have experienced pressure, people aged 30 to 34 are experiencing the greatest pain and generating the highest living cost pressure score. And so with that in mind, one of the things that another aspect that Mr. Christmas made in his report or his presentation, I should say, appears on page 37 of his presentation.
Yes, that's the wages price index page.
That's the. I'm looking though at the average compensation of employees, which he pointed to as demonstrating that people are able to gain an improvement in their incomes through promotion and moving up the scale. We would argue that this is in fact something that demonstrates the importance of maintaining those an increase to those higher award rates as well, which is why we are asking for a percentage-based increase up those levels. Now we're appreciating the point that you can target increases at the lowest paid. Many people have used that particular construction, but we would argue that the 7% that is being supported by Unions WA and WACOS is the highest, strongest increase for the low paid on offer at this particular hearing, and would also assist in maintaining the relativities and arguably the margin for skill between award rates. And this is not merely a detail. This goes to the question of how we are likely to assess matters such as productivity within the economy generally. Last year, the Australian Bureau of Statistics published an article which asked, has worker compensation been reflected in labour productivity growth? And it found that on average, between about the mid-90s to 21-22, a 1% increase in labour productivity resulted in roughly a 0.8% point increase in real compensation provided to workers. This has had a cumulative effect of essentially wages running behind productivity. And so a neglect, we would argue, of the margin for skill within award rates, both arising from and reflected in the compression of those rates, which of course can happen in any number of award systems, but the WA Commission has recently been counteracting through its decisions that incorporate percentage increases. Insofar as that doesn't happen, insofar as there's a flattening or a compression of those rates, that is part of the decoupling between workers' compensation and labour productivity, simply because there is no margin for skill and no skill recognition of skill for employees as they move through the system. So essentially, while governments and employer groups regularly lament the lack of productivity in the economy, there's very little that's being offered concrete to do about it. This is especially true when it comes to wage case hearings, when there's no actual claim. And indeed, the anti-productivity argument really comes to the fore when businesses claim that minimum wage increases could be opposed because employers might have to invest in new skill and equipment to make paying their workers worthwhile. So in that sense, the sort of marginal attachment to the labour force argument is really an anti-productivity argument in our view. It also leads to the general point about how the labour market works as, you've heard this word from me before, monopsony. This has been demonstrated in many research articles that have been cited and continue to be cited by Unions WA. You can read these obviously in our submission, so I won't reiterate them. I will respond, however, that the insistence by the Chamber that overseas studies should be treated cautiously by the Commission when applied to WA, in our view, is invalid. The WA economy, like the US, UK and European economies, is capitalist. In the IMF's definition, it is an economic system in which private actors own and control property in accordance with their interests. So there's no reason not to take studies of the way the minimum wage works and the actions of the labour market in other countries and apply them to Western Australia. Seminal articles like that of the late Professor David Plowman of UWA from 2006-2007, cited as part of his study of the WA labour market, the OECD, reports of the Health, Education, Labour and Pensions Committee of the US Senate, and the Journal of Economic Literature published by the American Economics Association. And in our view, they and others provide, in their study of the new economic literature on how minimum wage works, provide a great deal of evidence that workers are really price takers in these monopsonistic labour markets. And it's the institutional action to increase wages that are really the crucial way to improve living, not just improve living standards, but also improve productivity and improve consumption. In that sense, we would argue that the government and the Chamber cannot simultaneously argue that a pay increase is wrong because it puts too much pressure on businesses, small to medium enterprises, and yet at the same time the problem for small and medium enterprises is that they don't generate enough business. Chief Commissioner, you asked us to give some attention to the GOS GMI figures for retail trade, accommodation and food services. Those figures are in negative at the moment, though as you point out, they have bounced around a bit from previous years. We refer you to our reply submission, I think on our page 4, figure 11.
Yes.
Okay. So this is taken from the WACOS submission, so I won't try and steal WACOS's thunder on this point. But just drawing attention to the first few activities on their list, coping mechanisms, in this case under pressure of utility bills, reduce spending on food and groceries, reduce spending on leisure activities. Similarly, figure 7 on the following page, page 5, which is taken from the ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Survey. Extremely low scores for time to buy a major household item. Really, the extent to which people are under pressure from a utility bill increase such that they have to cut back on spending, some of those might be discretionary, but I would think that groceries and food would enter into the essential and non-discretionary items as well. Time to buy a major household item, that might be essential, that might not be essential. The point is, there's really going to be very little way back from any negative results for the retail trade or accommodation and food industries unless there's some demand back in the system, unless there's some consumption back in the system. And that is going to require, in our view, a substantial real increase to minimum and award wages. At the very least, something that provides a way forward for consumers and household consumption, which, as we established at the beginning, with Mr. Christmas's presentation from Treasury, insofar as household consumption is expected to decline, the question of do we want it to decline so drastically that we tip the WA economy into recession, or are we trying for a soft landing here? If we're trying for a soft landing, then we cannot simply expect that there be a precipitous drop. There has to be something that maintains purchasing power, maintains household consumption going forward. We would argue further to some of the points about the way the WA economy works. Where the WA economy does display specific characteristics, such as the importance of the mining industries, Unions WA argues that the significance of that industry is treated highly inconsistently. That the mining industry can exist at all is a tribute to the good luck that WA has in having minerals that can be dug up. First Nations people know all too well how entitled that industry feels to resources that have been there under the ground for millions of years. The wealth that is generated is not the singular property of mining companies, which somehow doesn't count when it comes to assessing sort of the request for pay rises generally in other industries in the economy. Yes, WA workers do benefit from items like the terms of trade that mining exports generate, but so do WA employers. Workers across all industries play their part in the success of the mining industry, and that cannot be abstracted away, in our view, simply by sort of dividing between mining and non-mining, and imagining a sort of fantasy economy of WA that somehow mining ceases to exist.
I think I might have made the comment in previous state wage cases when a similar argument was put about the dominance of the mining sector, and that is the adage that a rising tide lifts all boats. In terms of the feed-down effect from the economic growth of one sector, because obviously the support which that industry has through supply chains within the state, other businesses and remote towns and communities, of course, are supported by that same industry.
Mm. That is certainly the case, Commissioner. It is also the point, though, perhaps and this perhaps leads to another section as well, that insofar as businesses in Western Australia are competing with the mining industry for skilled staff, this is particularly the case, I might add, just to refer to another submission that was made to this wage case from Wolga. Wolga has a great deal of, local governments, I should say, have a great deal of difficulty maintaining staff levels and therefore service levels, especially in regions, precisely because their skilled staff is attracted by the mining industry, which, as we've seen in other presentations, does have a large amount of employment growth and is in competition with other sections as well. So part of the issue for other industries is, of course, the scarcity of skilled labour. Now, to an extent, that would be mitigated by sort of people coming into the states, as has been expected, increases in population and things like that. But it is still a point that the heavy presence of the mining industry can represent a cost as well as a benefit in that regard too. I'd also point out that in some of our results in some of the stuff that we put in our initial submission regarding the pressures on living costs in various sort of regional areas, that the presence of the mining industry also drives up rents as well in some of those regional towns and areas too. So once again, not a cost-free exercise. So in our submissions, we've made the case that wage growth in WA does need the decisions of institutions such as the Industrial Relations Commission. Just recently, the economist Jeff Borland from the University of Melbourne has published an analysis. This only came out yesterday, but I'm happy to provide it to the Commission if it helps. Basically showing that what's attributing low wage growth to wage-setting institutions that are framed for a low inflation environment, especially EBAs that are locked in for a number of years. He also makes the point that public sector pay caps have also had a binding constraint on overall wage growth as well. So we reiterate the importance of the Commission actually making a decision for a real wage increase. And as I say, on the table, only Unions WA and WACOS are making such a claim. As far as sources for potential inflation goes, look, there simply hasn't been really any evidence that any of the inflation is coming from wages. The Treasury did provide the chart. I won't spend too much time trying to look into this section. Oh, here we go. Page 43 of the Treasury presentation that showed the relationship between Perth's CPI and the supply chain index. There simply really is no basis for arguing that a wage increase needs to be lower than it otherwise would because of the danger of inflation, because inflation simply hasn't been coming from wage increases. And notwithstanding that there obviously are wage increases coming from places in the system, there's very little evidence that in aggregate they're actually causing an increase in CPI. We note that the Chamber has provided this hearing with the most recent copy of its most recent business confidence survey. This has been discussed earlier in the day. The Chief Commissioner did make the point that if the sources of WA business are correct in saying that they're recently increasing their base wages by around 11%, that does indicate that bargaining and above award increases are in fact taking place, in which case that an increase that would be awarded from this tribunal would really be being absorbed into the system. And that's also the case when you consider, if 1 in 5 are offering one-off financial awards. One-off financial awards are, as a matter of union principle, not our particularly favourite way of compensating employees, but nevertheless, we do think that that indicates that there is a capacity for WA businesses to pay because they're already paying. Furthermore, to the extent that there are businesses out there that are put at a competitive disadvantage for labour, because that whole section in the Business Confidence Survey comes under a section that talks about labour shortages. To the extent that smaller businesses are at fact a competitive disadvantage for wages and disadvantage for competing for employees in the labour market, excuse me, extent to which a institutional increase that raises the floor generally will put those businesses at a much better position to retain their existing staff, not least because they're not being put in a competitive disadvantage with the rest of award wage employers as well. So with that in mind, we have previously pointed out that surveys of businesses should be treated with caution. The Fair Work Commission has made this in a number of its annual wage reviews decisions, basically pointing out that business surveys are credible to the extent that they corroborate existing data that comes out from sources such as the ABS or the Reserve Bank. So to finish off, basically Unions WA argues that there should be a 7% increase for minimum and award wage workers. It should apply from the first pay period after the end of June 2023, with no delays for selected industries. It should also be fully passed on to apprentices and juniors as well. Our view is similar to the government, that if we want people to stay within training, we need to make training worth their while and training to pay in order for them to retain their position. Vacancy data, including the most recent, shows that there are workers are still, or employees rather, are still in demand in Western Australia, but we don't think that real wages are going up commensurate to that. It's also the case that vulnerable groups of employees, such as female workers, are likely overrepresented within low-wage roles. Workers with this profile are less likely to negotiate their own agreements, so they're unlikely to be within that section where the 11% pay increases are purportedly happening within the surveyed WA businesses, so they're more likely to be award reliant. And generally speaking, wage growth in WA and Australia, real wage growth in WA and Australia really does rely on a lot of those institutional decisions to actually increase wages. So in that sense, while the WA and Australian economies are still performing strongly, even if there is caution about headwinds, the minimum and award wage workers would still be in a better position to handle those headwinds with a real and substantial increase to the minimum wage. I'll now turn briefly to our submissions on the state wage principles.
Yes, thank you.
Specifically Principle 7. I won't repeat what's in our initial submission. That contains the bulk of what we're proposing. It has struck us, though, that I have prepared a document that hopefully gives a better idea, not least because it's in colour, about what it is that we're actually proposing.
Yes, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. So, as previously stated, look, we believe that some of the principles that were established in a November 2022 reasons for decision in the aged care case, or the aged care awards case, provide the basis for a better and certainly more streamlined test on work value. With that in mind, we have proposed that that some changes be made to work value number 7. Work principle number 7 on work value. You'll see the principal changes are really within 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, and with a small change in 7.5. The rest of the principle remains unchanged. Look, we're certainly keen for ongoing discussions with the state government on the process of this change. We do, however, think that really, as far as the scope of the change goes, it's a harmonisation measure. It addresses a more up-to-date process that's coming out of the national system. Notwithstanding differences between the state and national system, we don't think there's anything fundamentally inapplicable in the state system there as well. So we would certainly look forward to, as part of ongoing discussions, this being adopted. And with that, as that pleases the Commission, that concludes our presentation. We reserve the right to respond to other submissions and happy to take any questions.
Thank you.
Dr. Diamond, where does the 7% figure come from? How do you get to 7%?
So 7% we thought to keep consistent with the most recent national monthly CPI figure, bearing in mind that that's not the same as the WA figure. We did, however, want it to be higher than the more recent sort of quarterly WA figure for the reason we outlined, that when we looked back on June to June, because unfortunately the June figures come in after this wage case is concluded, so we're always looking backwards. We did feel that there was a shortfall that we felt needed to be addressed. And while we appreciate that wage cases are invariably forward-looking rather than backward-looking, we did feel that there was grounds for some recognition that sort of the real wages, if you like, had still gone backwards in relation to that CPI. If you treat...
So that's the table that you've handed up?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And also, thank you, Dr. Diamond. The journal article that you referred to, that would be very helpful if we could receive that in due course.
Okay, is that the Jeff Borland article?
Yes.
Yes, I can certainly do that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those submissions. Mr. Benson, please. Mr. Hanson, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. May it please the Commission in court session, the WA Council of Social Service is relying on its submission that an increase to the state minimum wage rate of 7% is essential to meet the needs of low-paid workers and to contribute to improved living standards for employees. I'll talk through 3 points raised in our submission as to why we consider a raise to be essential. I'll focus primarily on the eroded purchasing power of workers before briefly discussing income inequity in WA and the gender wage gap. Firstly, we are concerned that the significant and sustained price increases experienced by Western Australians has eroded the purchasing power of workers earning the state minimum wage. An increase in the minimum wage of 7% is necessary to close the gap between declining real wages and essential living costs, and to maintain low-paid workers' living standards in line with community expectations. As outlined by Mr. Christmas, CPI figures for the March quarter recorded an annual rise of 5.8% for the Perth area. Nationally, non-discretionary inflation increased by 7.2% from the previous year. Households earning low wages spend a greater proportion of their income on essential services. Non-discretionary inflation has a particularly significant impact on their capacity to meet their needs. For Perth, food and non-alcoholic beverages experienced a significant annual percentage increase of 7.5%, while health costs increased on an annual basis for Perth by 5.4%. Rents in Perth increased on an annual basis by 7.6% and from the previous quarter by 2%. This increase saw Perth experiencing the highest annual change of any capital city in Australia, the second highest quarterly change in rents. Housing is typically the single largest cost for households in Western Australia, and housing costs have a disproportionate impact on those living on the lowest incomes. Over the past 12 months, median house rents in Perth increased by more than 14.6% and median unit rents by 17.9%, according to data published by the Real Estate Institute of WA. Households are considered to be in housing stress when their housing costs exceed 30% of their income. Currently, the weekly median rent for a unit accounts for over 60% of the state minimum wage, while the median rent for a house is over 67%. As such, if a household earning the minimum wage is paying over 60% of their income on rent for a median rental property, then they can most certainly be understood to be in severe housing stress. It is worth noting too that an analysis released just this month by the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre found that the cost of rental properties in the lower quartile of prices has risen even faster than the rest of the market, with no sub-regions in Greater Perth considered to be affordable for lower income households. Data published in the West Australian on Tuesday this week from realestate.com's Prop Track report revealed that only 3.9% of houses advertised for rent in Perth cost less than $400 a week. A recent report by Anglicare Australia and Everybody's Home compared data on rents against the award wages for 15 essential worker categories. In this report, workers in hospitality, meatpacking, childcare and aged care were found to be spending the highest percentage of their incomes on rent. In Perth, all 15 essential worker categories were found to spend in excess of 50% of their income on rent, with hospitality workers and meatpackers having to spend 72% of their income. In northern Western Australia, hospitality workers and meatpackers would have to spend over 80% of their income on rent. The annual Anglicare Rental Affordability Snapshot, which examines properties advertised for rent, found only 5 properties across the whole of Perth that were considered affordable and appropriate for a single worker on the minimum wage. In the southwest, the Great Southern, the Midwest and Gascoyne, no properties were considered appropriate and affordable. In the northwest, the Wheatbelt and the Goldfields, only 2 properties in each region were affordable and appropriate for a single worker on the minimum wage. A recent survey of 330 renters, published in April 2023 by Make Renting Fair WA, found that 58% of respondents had experienced at least one rent increase in the last 2 years, and 14% had experienced 2 rental increases. 33% had a rent increase between $21 and $50 per week, 10% between $51 and $75 per week, and 11% had a rent increase between $76 and $100 per week. I would just note too that while the federal government has announced a modest increase to Commonwealth rent assistance, that this is a supplement only available to those eligible for specific social security payments or concession status, and so does not reduce the need at all for an increase in wages. The increasing price of food, particularly of healthy food, is also placing financial stress on low-wage workers. To manage increased food prices in a tight fiscal environment, people living on low wages resort to skipping meals, avoiding expensive items like dairy and meat, and purchasing cheaper, less healthy food options. Food Bank reports that in the last 12 months, 208,000 households went hungry in WA due to a lack of funds, including skipping meals or going an entire day without eating. They found that 59% of food insecure households in Western Australia had someone in paid employment, with WA having the highest rate of working people accessing Food Bank in the nation. The 2022 Understanding Utility Hardship Report by Wakos and the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre included quantitative survey data from 470 Water Corporation customers. This data revealed income to be the largest contributing factor to utility hardship, with the lower the income, the higher the probability of being unable to pay water or electricity bills. The 2 greatest contributors to a household's inability to pay for bills were having an annual household income under $40,000 and having an annual household income between $40,000 and $80,000. The disproportionate impact of utility bills on low-income households can lead to mounting unpaid bills and a greater risk of disconnection, which in turn can have a significant impact on people's well-being. Reported impacts include feelings of shame at being unable to provide for the family, along with personal and relationship stress resulting from difficult decisions about spending priorities. Survey respondents who are unable to pay their utility bills indicated that reducing spending on food was the most common strategy they used to cope financially. 76% of those who are unable to pay their electricity bills and water bills, and 79% of those unable to pay gas bills, indicated that they reduced spending on food. This was closely followed by reducing spending on leisure activities and reducing their consumption of water, electricity or gas. The recently announced $400 electricity credit that is being provided by the state government is welcome, but this is only temporary assistance and does not remove the need for sustained wage increases. I would also note that as the average electricity bill for a single person is $315, as noted on the Synergy website, the $400 credit will likely only cover at most 1 or 2 electricity bills for many households. Also announced was a targeted $500 electricity credit, but it should be noted that this is only for households who are solely or largely reliant on government income support. Likewise, we don't believe that increases to the hardship utility grant limits reduce the need to increase wages. It's important to recognise that these grants are only available for households who are assessed as being in financial hardship and have an outstanding bill over $300 once they have been in a payment arrangement for 90 days. These grants exist to help households in a crisis and for those who they are the only means to avoid disconnection and escalating debts. It is certainly not a replacement for or alleviate the need for an adequate wage that can afford to cover utility bills in the first instance. The Understanding Utility Hardship Report also examined data sets held by the Financial Counselling Network, covering the household budgets of 7,000 clients. This analysis found that people most commonly access the Financial Counselling Network services when they are managing on low or inadequate incomes or having private debt issues. More than a fourth of Financial Counselling Network clients were found to have paid employment income or income from a business. On average, debt repayments represented an enormous 43% of households' expenditures for these clients at $807 per fortnight, which was $200 more per fortnight on average than what they were paying on housing, which is usually a household's highest expenditure item. The financial pressure resulting from the combination of increased costs and low incomes have significant impacts beyond financial security. For low-income earners, financial pressure works to disrupt the foundational elements of health and well-being, such as access to safe and appropriate housing and quality nutrition. Applying the social determinants of health model, it's evident that limited access to the foundational elements of health creates significant and longer-term inequity, including poorer longer-term health outcomes and lower life expectancy. Secondly, while the gap between the state minimum wage and the relative poverty threshold of 60% of median earnings contracted slightly following the 2022 state wage case decision, that gap remains significant, with further progress needed to narrow that gap and address the needs of the low paid. The state minimum wage is currently $171 per week below the relative poverty line of 60% of median earnings. As of November 2022, the state minimum wage was 41% of the WA average weekly ordinary time earnings. In comparison, the national minimum wage comprises 44.95% of Australia-wide seasonally adjusted average weekly earnings as of November 2022. Finally, the WA labour market continues to be characterised by a significant gender pay gap. ABS data indicates that WA currently supports the biggest difference in overall pay between men and women by a significant margin across all jurisdictions, with a gender pay gap of 22.1%. While the gender pay gap has many contributing factors, much of it results from the gendered concentration of staff in high-paying industries within WA, with women making up a significant proportion of the workforce in lower-paying industries. As a result, due to their reliance on lower wages, women are disproportionately adversely affected by increased cost of living pressures. Increased cost pressures also have significant ramifications for women's longer-term economic security, with women under financial pressure less likely to make additional superannuation contributions, pay off debt, or save. Rapid and sharp increases in the cost of living mean low-income earners currently do not have sufficient funds to meet the rising costs of rent, food, and electricity. For state minimum wage earners, this pressure can manifest in behaviour changes such as skipping meals or not heating or cooling their homes. These behavioural changes increase inequity across a range of social determinants of health and create a negative and self-reinforcing relationship between increasing needs and increasing financial pressure. Thus, the cycle of inequality is embedded. Increasing the state minimum wage is an effective strategy to help break this cycle. If it pleases the Commission in court session, that concludes the submission from the WA Council of Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson. Thank you very much indeed for those submissions. Now, are there any replies from anyone at the bar table to what's been put to us today? Mr. Incident?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. I'll just make a few brief points just on some of the issues that have been raised today. Just briefly on the CCI's business confidence survey, and we appreciate getting a copy of that. Sorry, I'll just bring up my notes. While the Minister readily acknowledges that the WPI doesn't necessarily measure all forms of wage increases, and it has its limitations. It is, however, still a highly regarded measure. In its initial submission and submissions and reply, we've heard a lot of discussion about the average increase of 11.3% in retail and hospitality. We still find it difficult to reconcile that figure with all of the other wages data. Now, certainly it's true that there are different measures of wages growth, and we have looked at a few of them. Mr. Christmas had a few of them this morning. There's measures for WPI, including bonuses, and that does get into the fives. So you do get above 5% if you're looking at year on year. Private sector WPI, average weekly, the WPI figure for the private sector, including bonuses. And there is also a compensation of employees figure, a per capita figure, which does get into the fives as well. And that'll pick up everything. That'll pick up things like superannuation as well, which has been going up by 0.5% per annum. And so there are measures like that. And there are measures, obviously the WPI is like a basket of jobs. It's a little bit like the CPI, and obviously it doesn't pick up wage increases that come from promotions and from things like that. So certainly there are other measures like average weekly earnings, average weekly ordinary time earnings. There's also the measure from the single touch payroll data, which is released also by the ABS, but that comes pretty much straight out of the employers reporting through the single touch payroll systems. But now some of those measures, a number of those measures do get above 5%, somewhere between 5 and 6. However, we're certainly not seeing 11 or 12% increases across the board as being the norm when it comes to data. And indeed, if it was, then it does raise the question, well, it raises a couple of questions. As we said in the submission reply, that it wouldn't, those employees wouldn't be award reliant anymore because they would be receiving wage increases quite a bit in excess of what awards are increasing by. But also then, as you noted, Chief Commissioner, what impact would the state wage case decision have if people were receiving such large wage increases across the board? And would people be complaining about negative real wages growth if that was kind of the reality for most people in those industries? So we suspect that most people aren't receiving double-digit wage increases across the board in their base wages. That's not to say that there aren't subsections and occupations that are receiving those increases. And I'm sure there are some people receiving more than that, but on an aggregate basis, that's not showing up in the data. We do, however, agree with the CCI that elevated inflation certainly affects businesses as well as households, and we've made that point in a few places that it does increase costs for both employers and for the workers who are facing higher bills. Just in regards to Unions WA's comments, and we note that they're asking for a 7% increase, and we appreciate the response from Dr. Diamond on where that figure comes from. The main point just make regarding the minister not nominating a specific quantum. The minister submits that there's nothing unusual or remarkable about governments of the day not nominating a specific figure in state wage case matters or in wage case matters in general, although they're welcome to do so if they wish. It's noted that the minister didn't quantify a proposed increase in 2020 or in 2022. And indeed, the CCI and WALGA haven't put forward a specific quantum in this year's proceedings, as is their prerogative. The minister notes that current and past federal governments haven't quantified an exact position in the annual wage review for many years, going back decades, and nothing remarkable's come of that. So the minister doesn't accept that Section 50 parties have an obligation, whether it's legal or otherwise, to nominate specific figures. It's not a requirement of the legislative framework. We don't believe that Section 50 should be read down in that way. The state wage case, like the annual wage review, is largely an evidence-based process that involves parties, different stakeholders and interested parties making a variety of submissions and providing a range of statistical data, all of which feed into the decision-making process. And we submit that it's open to parties to craft their submissions in the manner that they deem most appropriate on that. With regard to the quantum itself, certainly the minister's not suggesting that there shouldn't be an increase or that employers can't afford an increase. Indeed, the minister has, in a number of places, supported a fair and meaningful increase as part of these proceedings, and has acknowledged that low-paid workers are in need of an adjustment to their rates of pay to be able to meet the cost of living and to maintain fair wage standards. And in regards to WACOS's data, we thank WACOS for the detailed information on housing affordability and food and utilities and transport. Some of that data is stuff that WACOS is privy to from different data sources, so and comes from different areas, not all ABS. So the minister certainly appreciates that background information as well. If it pleases the Commission Court session, that was all that I had to follow up on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hedgkin. Dr. Wesley, anything you wish to raise in reply?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. Yes, just a couple of points, and then Mr. Collins will also add some further remarks. So just in regards to the Union's WA's view of disregarding our submission in regards because we didn't put a number forward. So it was in line with our position last year, and our argument still stands that we're facing a dynamic environment and considerable uncertainty exists. And obviously it has been a change in approach from previous state wage cases, but we still are facing very uncertain times and difficult, challenging, and it is challenging to actually put forward a particular figure. There's just a couple of other points that I want to raise, and particularly reiterating the importance of a flat dollar increase as compared to a percentage rate increase, particularly with WACOS's submissions and comments today about the impact that it has on the lowest paid. We still stand by those that a flat dollar increase targeted is the most effective way of helping those at the lowest levels. The other point that I want to make, particularly in response to the Union's WA, is about a risk factor for inflation is in fact high wage growth, and the RBA are certainly conscious of wage growth as one of the many factors that they're monitoring going forward. And I also, to put further support to the role of the tax and transfer system. It is important. If we were to take that away, it would have a measurable impact on those in the lowest paid. So it is something that requires weight and consideration. I might just now leave it.
Does that cut both ways though? Because businesses receive supports as well.
Yeah, but it's not to the extent that, I mean, at the moment we've got the energy credit, which is, I think it was $650. But the list of supports that exist for, in terms of low paid, is quite a bit larger than that. Because we certainly didn't see any tax breaks and the like, particularly at the state level in terms of payroll tax and the like. We didn't see any breaks.
Thank you.
I'll just pass over to Mr. Collins just to make some final remarks.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Collins.
Thank you. Just in reference to the Chief Commissioner's earlier statement regarding the gross operating surplus in
Yes,
the
thank you.
GMI table, according to the ABS, GOS plus GMI is gross value added minus compensation of employees minus taxes payable. Therefore, one conceivable reason for a decline in some of the industries that we mentioned before is either a reduction in the revenue, an increase in wages paid, or a combination of both. And this is particularly given that these industries you mentioned are services based. In any case, what it does show is that an increase in the pressures that these industries are facing or have faced, over the last year or so. Just referring to Unions WA and where they got their 7% figure from, looking at the monthly CPI, I'd just like to make a comment that the monthly CPI is still an experimental series, which needs to be taken with caution. So the quarterly CPI release is still the preferred release as per the ABS and also the RBA when they consider their interest rate decisions as well. Monthly CPI is also only measured nationally, as opposed to quarterly data, which shows how inflation varies across different states in Australia as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. Dr. Diamond, you had the opportunity of hearing your friends. Did you wish to add anything at this stage? Entirely a matter for you, of course.
I will. Oh, excuse me, Commissioner. Look, I will just make a couple of points. So obviously we can rehash the point again about the whether a sort of amount should be put in as a claim. I would say that really, as far as matters being times, I should say, being dynamic and uncertain. You look further enough, most times have some level of dynamic and uncertain elements to them. And we don't think that just because that's the case, that if the minimum wage hearing and award raise hearing are important enough to put in a submission to, then they are important enough that it should be prepared to nominate a figure. Otherwise, we don't think that a lot of the information is necessarily all that useful as far as a guide goes for making a final decision. In terms of flat dollar increases versus percentages, whether this is the most effective path forward for helping the low paid. The most effective way forward for helping the low paid is to give them a large increase. And with that in mind, the notion of sort of targeted increases that just sort of go flat dollar, we see that as leaving the door open too much to a ineffective increase at the lower end. As far as the risk factor in wages, look, the RBA has also indicated in some of its figures a concern about the pricing policies of businesses as well. In our submissions, I think in our submission in reply, we provided some information about some of the markups that have been taking place in certain retailers to benefit from to increase their earnings, notwithstanding that sales might be not going up as much. And with that in mind, we think that that is a risk factor for inflation as well that needs to be addressed by wages. As far as the question of gross value added, reductions in revenue and increases in cost, well, there are various ways in which you can get a increase in cost, but one thing that definitely gives you a reduction in revenue is less people spending in your businesses and less consumption. And to go on from that point, Look, minimum wages certainly can't be seen as the single tool by which all disadvantage is addressed, but you're not going to make a lot of progress on addressing social ills unless wages essentially make work pay, unless wages provide a improving living standard over time. And there is simply no alternative to that to anything in the tax transfer system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Dyke. Mr Hanson, is there anything you wish to add? Please do so.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. I just wanted to make a brief comment regarding the mention around social housing as a means to ameliorate the impacts of rents on minimum wage workers. I just want to note that while the state government is building 1,000 social housing dwellings, that is going to take quite some time, but also social housing only constitutes less than 4% of dwellings in Western Australia. And there are currently 34,000 people on the social housing wait list, and that's just people on the wait list, not everyone who could potentially be eligible for social housing. Also, a significant proportion of that social housing is public housing, or what is known as community housing band A, which has an upper income limit, so you're no longer eligible to be there once you're earning more than $486 a week. So based on that, we think that minimum wage workers are very much still at the mercy of the private rental market. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that submission, Mr Hanson. Well, thank you everyone for your submissions today and also your written submissions and reply submissions. They've been very helpful. As was agreed at the programming meeting earlier this year, we'll now adjourn and await the decision of the Fair Work Commission to be handed down, and we'll reconvene when that occurs as shortly as possible thereafter. So in the meantime, we'll stand adjourned until then. Thanks very much.
We stand adjourned.